I ran intake at Kesh Transit Depot for 6 years before anyone above my pay grade noticed how I filled out the ledger, and by then, it didn't matter what they thought of it. The depot sat on the dry side of a border moon, a converted cargo terminal with 3 intake lanes, 2 working heaters, and a triage protocol that had been written by people who never had to look the refugees in the eye while applying it. The protocol was simple. Every arriving family got assessed on transport availability, medical burden, and resettlement cost, and every arriving family got a letter and a number. A band meant you were on a ship within the week. M band meant you waited, sometimes months, in the camp outside. Z band meant the system had run the numbers and decided you probably weren't worth moving. Z band families got a cot, a ration card, and a stamped line in the depot ledger. Nobody above me ever called it a death sentence. They called it resource-realistic prioritization. I'd been doing the job long enough to know what that meant in practice. You stopped counting Z-band arrivals as people you'd see again. The Doran family came through my lane on a gray processing morning, with nothing but a travel case, 2 children, and the particular stillness of people who have already been told bad news more than once, and have stopped flinching at it. The father, Osen, had a burn scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone, still shiny with regen gel. The mother, Ilith, held the smaller child on her hip and didn't set her down the entire time I processed them. Not even to sign the manifest. She signed left-handed, awkward, without letting go. The older boy stood very straight and watched my hands the way you watch a machine you expect to hurt you. I ran their numbers. Regen therapy for the father's injury, resettlement cost for 4, no sponsor on file, no skills match on the open manifests. The terminal gave me the assessment before I'd even finished the medical intake. Z9, lowest active tier. I'd seen the code enough times to know what happened to it after I filed it. It went into the ledger as a stamped line, species, head count, tier, date, and the file sat in the queue behind every A&M band request that came in after it, which was to say, forever. I had filed maybe 400 of those lines myself. I didn't think about them individually anymore. That was the only way to keep doing the job. Osen watched me type. He'd clearly processed through stations like mine before, because when the terminal chimed with the tier result, he didn't ask what it meant. He just said, quiet and flat, like a man reciting something he'd already made peace with. We understand. Whatever you need to write. The boy's hand found his father's sleeve and gripped it. I looked at the ledger line waiting to be filed. Line 241. The fields were already populated, Doran, X4, Z9, and a stamp field waiting for my thumbprint to lock it. I sat there with my thumb over the plate for a few seconds longer than the job required. Then I picked up the stylus instead, and in the margin next to the stamp field, in graphite, I wrote their names: Osen, Ilith, the boy, Cade, the girl, small enough that she hadn't spoken the whole intake, Sael. I wrote them the way you'd write them in a letter to someone who was going to ask after them later, not the way you'd write a case file. Then I stamped the line. Because the stamp still had to go in, the tier was still Z9. The Q position didn't change because of 4 words in graphite. I want to be clear about that. Nothing about their transport priority moved. I couldn't do that. What I could do was make sure that if anyone ever pulled line 241 out of the depot archive, they wouldn't find 4 numbers. They'd find 4 names. Osen read what I'd written upside down, the way people learn to read paperwork they're not supposed to be able to read from across a counter. He went very still. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, I said. It doesn't change the number. I know that too. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look I'd gotten maybe twice in 6 years. And it wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was closer to disbelief, like he was checking my face for the catch. There wasn't one. I handed him his ration card and his cot assignment and told him where the heater lane was, because it got cold on the dry side of the moon after dark, and Z9 families weren't issued extra blankets. They stayed in the camp for 11 months. I saw them sometimes, at range, across the yard. Osen working the water reclaim line for extra ration credit. Ilith teaching Sael to walk properly for the first time since the burn. Cade growing 4 inches in a way that made his sleeves look wrong. I never told them I remembered the line. There wasn't a reason to. I didn't write their names hoping for anything back. I wrote them because the alternative was pretending 400 lines a year were only numbers, and I'd decided somewhere around line 30 that I wasn't going to keep doing this job if that was the price of it. I want to say I did this for every family that came through my lane after that, and mostly I did, but I won't pretend it was simple. Some days the queue ran 300 deep, and the terminal auto-populated faster than I could think, and I filed stamped lines with nothing in the margin, because there wasn't time, because the supervisor was watching the throughput numbers, because I was tired in a way that made the graphite feel like more weight than I had left to lift. I'm not telling you I was better than the job. I'm telling you that on the days I had it in me, I used it, and the Doran line was the one that stuck with me. Maybe because Cade's grip on his father's sleeve was the kind of detail you don't get to unsee. There was a season, my third year, when a review board audited the depot's intake practices, and one line item on their report noted, without elaboration, that a non-trivial percentage of archived Z-band files contained unauthorized personal annotations by processing staff. Nobody was disciplined. Nobody asked me directly. I think, in the end, correcting 400 margins a year across a whole depot staff was more paperwork than the department wanted to generate, so the annotations stayed, quietly, in files nobody expected anyone to read again. A transport finally opened for them in the 12th month, not because their tier changed, but because a resettlement world further out took an unusually large Z-band intake that cycle, one of the rare years the math worked in their favor instead of against it. I processed their outbound manifest myself. Osen stopped at the counter before he left. "You wrote us down," he said. Not a question. I did. Why? I didn't have a clean answer for him then, and I don't have a cleaner one now. I told him something close to the truth. That the tier code was the depot's decision, and I had to file it. But the ledger was the only piece of paper in that entire building that was mine to write in, and I wasn't going to spend 6 years filling it with numbers when I had a hand and enough graphite to do otherwise. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded once, the way you nod at something you've decided to carry with you, and walked his family out to the transport pad. 9 years later, a woman in a resettlement authority uniform came through my lane still, I never did leave the depot, and asked to pull an archived file. Line 241, Doran family, 12 years back. I asked her why. She said she was building a case for a policy review, evidence that the old triage archive had been quietly amended by intake staff over the years, small acts of insubordination the department wanted documented and stopped. I pulled the file up on the terminal between us. Z9, stamped, dated, and in the margin, 4 names in graphite that had gone slightly gray with a decade of storage. She looked at it for a long time before she spoke. "I'm Sael," she said. "The other 3 names. That's my family." I didn't say anything right away. There wasn't a version of the moment that needed more than the 2 of us looking at the same 4 words on the same old line. "I wasn't trying to change your tier," I told her finally. "I couldn't have." "I know," she said. "You just made sure we weren't only the number." She didn't ask me to sign anything, or testify to anything. She asked if she could keep a copy of the line for herself, and I told her the whole file was already hers by rights, since her name was on it. She thanked me and left, and I went back to processing the morning's arrivals, because there were 40 more families in the yard waiting on numbers I still had to write down, and a margin next to every one of them still waiting on whatever else I decided to put there.